Okay, having established in my previous video how the basis for the shift from the author-driven to the director-driven strategies for defining theater culture, I wanted to discuss some of these director-driven strategies. Directors nowadays have assumed controlling power in theaters everywhere, worldwide. Grotowski and Beck, as I pointed out in earlier videos, established the authority of directors to take over theater culture. And although not every director has been influenced by either Jerzy Grotowski or Julian Beck, just about every director who has achieved a distinctive identity or authority in the theater has absorbed the legacy of Grotowski and Beck, and as a result, their legacy created these two basic categories of director-driven strategy for guiding theatrical performance. For Grotowski, the director is in tension with the text. He doesn't discard texts. He imposes himself upon them as a director. And in doing so, he dramatizes this fundamental conflict that is beyond the conflict within the text itself, this conflict between now and then, between the now of performance and the then when the text was written. It's a conflict with history. And that's what needs to be dramatized, as well as whatever themes the author had in mind when writing the play. Grotowski's approach is also about the conflict between performance and writing, you might say. The conflict between what the body says and what the text says, and what speech, the voice, the voice and the body in Grotowski, as you may recall, aren't really united. It's the voice struggles against the body, or the body struggles against the voice, and the actor's performance is a dramatization of that struggle, and the text acts as a foundation or justification for representing that struggle. And that's why I ask you to look at those videos of the directors, Peter Brook and Peter Stein and Julie Taymor, Peter Sellers, Jürgen Flimm. Much of Grotowski's approach, this director-driven kind of approach, or strategy, tends to rely on old plays. These directors don't seem to have much interest in the work of new authors. They're primarily interested in what to do with old plays like Shakespeare. The performance is about the director imposing of the director's personality on the text and reshaping it in relation to the now. Much of that philosophy developed in relation to staging Shakespeare or staging classic plays in other languages, Goethe in German, or Racine in French, or Ibsen in Norwegian. But it was mostly dead authors who couldn't complain about what the directors were doing that interested this branch of the director-driven strategy. much of the director cult, let us say, or director culture, developed in opera, in the taking of operatic masterpieces, Wagner or Mozart, and setting up this critique of these operas, this tension in relation to the operas, the intentions of the past with the intentions of the present. And now it's standard practice. Operas, Shakespeare's plays, let's take an example. A Shakespearean play like Julius Caesar or Hamlet. When Shakespeare wrote it, they had no deep historical consciousness of the times they were writing about. Julius Caesar takes place in ancient Rome, hundreds of years before Shakespeare, 1,600 years before Shakespeare lived. But when they did the play, they weren't deeply interested in historical authenticity. They just went out on stage and wore whatever they were wearing that day and acted out the performance in a way that lacked reference to historical details in the performance, just an abstract reference to history. And in the 19th century and into the 20th century, directors and theater producers sought to recover that, or to infuse the production with historical authenticity, and they would reconstruct ancient Rome in increasingly detailed fashion to make the performance ever more vivid for audiences. But by the time of the 1970s, directors had felt that was an exhausted aesthetic, and one that seemed to prevent the play from having much relevance. It set the play in an ever increasingly detailed but ever remote past. As of the image of the past looking so different from the world of the present in which the audience lived. So directors began to update and make the classic plays more relevant, and would set Hamlet or Julius Caesar in times more familiar to the audience. So actors would, if they set it in this American Civil War, everybody dressed up like Civil War soldiers in mid-19th century costumes. Or it's about the Great Depression in the 1930s. Julius Caesar set in the 1930s. It's about fascism and popular unrest as more familiar to audiences who live closer to that time. Or they'll set it in the 1960s and kind of counterculture Julius Caesar with this attitude toward the themes of the play shaped by contemporary perception, so that Julius Caesar appeared either as an establishment figure or a person who belonging to mainstream institution, or he represented this popular, transformative figure of change, the John F. Kennedy of this time or something like that, depending on what the director wants the play to say about the time in which the audience and he or she is living. So that has happened pervasively in relation to classic plays. The old realist model of trying to find the appropriate historical detail to reconstruct the time in which the play was written and the time in which it represents on the stage. That approach no longer has appeal, because the director is merely the servant of the author and subordinate to an authorial vision that places too much trust, you might say, in all these words that need to be contested. This trust needs to be contested. It needs to be challenged by bodies of those who are expected to perform the play. And that's what the performance is about. So that's why I wanted you to see these clips from the video clips, and the Peter Brook and Julie Taymor and Jürgen Flimm, just get an idea of how these directors think in terms of action in relation to the classic text. Because if you're seeking to be a theater director, the idea of being a servant to the play is not going to get you very far. You have to develop this assertive personality that allows performance to compete, as I say, with all these other modes of performance. And it's necessary to have a level of provocative inquiry, I guess, provocative inquiry into the authority of these classic texts. But by and large, directors are really interested in new plays if they want to establish themselves as power figures in theater. Beck had an even less enthusiastic attitude toward play text by the time he had become this guru or charismatic leader of the living theater. For Beck, the performance depended on the unique circumstances or conditions under which it happened. A large measure of improvisation was necessary to achieve the goals of performance, which are always related to the transformation of the individual and the society together. The transformation needs to happen in relation to an individual's release from bondage of some sort, repression, constraints on his or her capacity for enjoying life and experiencing it. But that freedom depends on a larger transformation of society. So theater functions as this communal activity that allows intersection of the individual and the social emancipation or transformation. And that kind of performance couldn't be scripted out or imagined or prescribed by somebody who largely sits alone and writes and tries to put on paper what is essentially a fantasy that others will enact. That approach is not the path to individual and social transformation, because from Beck's point of view, we're already in a script of life, playing roles imposed on us by a script written by people we don't even know, but they're in charge because they're responsible for the running of institutions and making laws and saying who we are and who we're not and what we can or cannot do or be and so forth. It's parents and schools and governments and corporations and all kinds of institutions. They have scripted our lives, and we need to abandon the script. Performance is a way in which to release ourselves from roles in which we have found ourselves in prison. Now, few directors have followed Beck's path as he implemented it or lived it, but his experience opened up a possibility, a way of understanding performance that was very innovative and liberating in ways that Beck never anticipated, but nevertheless created this other strategy for directors in asserting control or power over production. So the directors are they aren't so much authors of a play or a performance. They are like project managers. They shape a collaboration that's releasing all these energies in artists and those who work in the theater environment, and they guide in a managerial sort of a way all of these talents so that some other kind of performance happens that that doesn't really have a script to it and is much more unstable insofar as it changes from performance to performance, or it's capable of adaptation and modification and recycling and revision and so forth, because it isn't scripted. It's brought together by a different process of collaboration than happens when you're given a text and the text is guiding the performance choices, and so you have, you know, a whole way of determining the collaborative process. The script comes first, and you say, well, who's going to direct it? And so the director is chosen, you get the director, and the director says, well, who's going to be playing this role and this role and this role? And you have collaboration with those people who say, well, I'm familiar with these kinds of characters, these kind of actors would be good for this, these roles, and then you work with people to, once you've got your cast, assemble them for rehearsals and get all the technical people assigned their positions and so forth. So the play, the script, sort of sets up this process of working. Well, you don't have the script, you've got a different collaboration that says, well, what are the problems that we are facing? You ask these big questions, and you start this dialogue and have things going on in different kinds of meetings about, well, we need to do a performance, and basically the director is the big personality here, the guiding, charismatic figure, and the director is thinking about what needs to be communicated to an audience, and maybe it's something about all of these themes that playwrights still deal with, but need to be approached in a different way, such as political themes like immigration, or the inequality between the rich and the poor, or the relation of education to the economy, big issues, or sexuality or sexual orientation, and we need to say something about that. What shall we say? How do we perform our uncertainty about these issues, or how to solve them, and it's not clear how the performance, so things are performed out as a way of dialogue. It isn't that we're looking at the motive for this character and the blocking or movement of the character in relation to other characters on the stage. That comes about after a different process of dialogue in this kind of non-scripted kind of performance. So how do you perform, for example, something like an attitude toward sexual orientation? Suppose you are heterosexual and I am homosexual. How would you move in relation to some knowledge about or some disclosure of my homosexuality? How would you move in relation to me if you were a woman or a man? Or Okay, so we act this out. We say, well, how do we think about it? We don't think about it in our room and write down drafts and then go back over and whatnot. We think about it in performance. We think about, all right, I'm the homosexual, you are the heterosexual. Now you're a woman, heterosexual, how do you reply? And you're a man, okay? So we act this out, we perform it. That's how we think about it. And then we'd say, all right, this looks good, this is interesting, let's keep that. Let's keep that, throw this stuff out, this doesn't work, there's something wrong with it, and we can think about that later, but this is good, let's keep that. Now let's reverse it. I'm the heterosexual, you are the homosexual. How do you act homosexuality? How do I act heterosexuality in relation to the knowledge that I have of your homosexuality? So we reverse it. Let's act it out. Then we reveal something about both our about the performer's sexual orientation through the improvisation. And something comes out of it, and we say, all right, let's keep that, and let's keep that, but let's throw this out, let's throw that out. So we're building our production around pieces of information we have about each other through the performance of the bodies in the improvised environment. That is how this kind of director works in relation to a lot of performers. They're not interested in the great classic plays and what to do with Shakespeare in our time, but what do we do about the relation of sexual relations, or if I'm the immigrant and you are the natives, the citizen, and we reverse the roles. And you can do this many different ways in relation to different themes. And maybe the director says, well, you know, I don't like that movement. Would you do this? And let's see what happens. Put your hand here and let's, I see something's coming out. Work with it, that kind of thing. So it's a different kind of collaborative process. And it creates a different kind of performance. And that's what you have in the other videos, which I've asked you to look at. That's Tadeusz Kantor, the Polish, one of the very greatest directors ever. They didn't use text. He started with text, but like Grotowski, he moved in a new direction in the 1960s, and then moved toward this. I mean, the big theme was always World War II and the great devastation, the tragic, catastrophic consequences of that war on Poland. And he worked with this team of actors, just as Grotowski worked with in the theater lab in Lodz, Poland. Kantor in Warsaw had this group, and that was their theme all the time, and they kept exploring and never ran out of inspiration for them. So that's how they built their performances. There are no texts for the Dead Class, which is his most famous work. And I believe you can see the whole video it's in Polish, but it's a very imaginative kind of performance using really limited resources.